But this is the first period to get out of that mode. And that's because Xinhai, when you have to do the German way of being a soldier, you can't just be someone who is big and scary. There's a lot of things you have to study. And so when you go in, you must have a certain level of education. So that changed a huge thing. Another thing is, it's education. So in education and modernization period, this is, again, very important. China, for 1,000 years, is all about taking the Imperial Exam. And in the Imperial Exam, you study 9 books in total from Confucius. And when you take the exams, especially after the Ming Dynasty, after 1367, you're not allowed to, it's called 八股文. When you have an answer, you cannot say, I believe certain thing. So when you have to say something, it's a bit like, going to seminary. So it's like, because Confucius said this, therefore I'm answering this way. So it really limits people's way of thinking. And so the main people, Li Hongzhang, Zhang Zhedong, Yuan Shikai, another called Shen, these are the 3 big provincial governors. All of them, they could be in different, they probably had different views, but they all told the Empress Dowager, it's time to end the public examinations, which began in 600 AD. So it's been 1,300 years. Okay? So in 1905, or 1905, that was the last time that the imperial exams happened. And actually, this, for most Chinese scholars, this is the reason why there was a revolution. Because the public examination system, I think a little bit like, let's say, a bit like any other society. The only way for a society to be stable is that there is a hope for upward mobility. So that's why the US is always going to be pretty great, because most Americans kind of believe they might be the next Mark Zuckerberg. Very unlikely, but they might, right? So in China, it's the same thing. Before 1905, from 600 AD, or especially from 1080 to 1900, how come there were only like 3 or 4 dynasties? And each dynasty lasted for so long, even though most of the emperors were morons. It's because there's a very, very slight chance you might come first in the public examination system, which means that you have a huge probability afterwards to become the prime minister. So anyone, so that kind of upward mobility, let's say in the 11th century, 12th century, was something that would be unheard of in Europe. Yeah. And China already had that kind of very fair system. But then because the curriculum went against the modernization of the country with topics that didn't matter, they ended it. And so how did they choose who to become like an official? What they did was they would send people out to study let's say in Japan, mostly in Japan because Japan was close, and then you come back with a certificate, and bam. If you've studied, so it changed, you remember what I was talking about in the Opium Wars or Taiping Rebellion or whatever, everybody still had an argument about Chinese thought might be, okay, Chinese machinery might not be as good as the Western, but Chinese thinking must be pretty good, right? After the Sino-Japanese War, after the 1898 100-day reform, after the Boxer Rebellion, there were no pretense. Everything in China is bad. So we're going to cut them. The biggest thing, Confucius text, civil examination system. You can go to Japan, you study in Japan, you come back, bam, you can go into government. And so
But that was probably only open to people with money.
With money. But what's interesting is, so by 1905, the first level examination was still taken, and they were actually sponsored by the government to go to Japan. Japan, obviously, and I'll get into that later, is the center for revolutionaries. So actually, most of the revolutionaries, including the right-hand man of Sun Yat-sen, he was actually government-sponsored scholar to study in Japan, learned about the revolution, and come back and overthrew the Qing government. So again, it's literally throwing a stone on your own foot.
Sun Yat-sen, he was educated in the U.S., wasn't
he? U.S. I'll get into him later. So so what's interesting about this is, so they all go, and then what do Chinese people do best? Counterfeit. So as soon as this becomes a thing, there were Chinese people would run printing presses where you would go and then they would just print you a fake certificate. So a lot of the so-called the foreign students who've studied in Japan would not be able to speak any Japanese. They would just go, they would walk around, they have fun, they come back. And so that's kind of the gist of things. Chiang Kai-shek would be one of them. So Chiang Kai-shek would be a very frequent sponsor and consumer of geishas. And so that was a thing, yeah. And so another thing, this is in terms of education and military, two of the main areas. And then also they actually, especially in Yuan Shikai's area, they created, based on the Continental Code, business law. So that was also those 10 years were actually very vibrant in terms of industrialization, especially around the coastal areas where people would found their own factories, so on and so forth. Okay? And then another thing would be the main year to look at in this period would be 1905. From 1904 to 1905, there was the Russo-Japanese War. Russia and Japan, they couldn't settle who would take over Manchuria, which is part of China at the time, and who would take over Korea, so they fought. So it's a little bit like if you and some other guy were to want to rob me or rob my house, but then you can't figure out who would rob which room, so you guys fight in my house, right? Okay? And then, so when they fought, and so there are many different reasons, but for whatever reason, Japan won in 1905. What's really interesting is that China and Chinese people were overwhelmingly supportive of the Japanese. They obviously would not know what would be coming at them in like 1915, 1931, 1937, whatever. But they were, for a few reasons, they're Asian, Japanese Asian, and Russians have been taking advantage of China for way too long, especially in 1901 to 1904. So a lot of the Japanese spies, whatever, were actually and they were Japanese soldiers were actually supported by a lot of the Chinese local population, and that's one of the main reasons why the Japanese won. But when they won, one huge debate happened in the country, which was Russia at the time was still an absolute monarchy. Japan is a constitutional monarchy. So for the Chinese court and also for the Chinese scholars, it was really a fight against between two political systems. The constitutional monarchy fighting the absolute monarchy, and the constitutional monarchy won. Therefore, China must also go into constitutional monarchy to build its own constitution. So in 1905, what happened was that 5 top officials, they left China to go around different countries, including America, including the UK, Japan, to learn about their political systems. So you can think, it's really bizarre. So you can think about, like today, like someone in like they're like the vice prime minister level, because that's what they were. 5 of them in China would go around the world to learn what other democracies are like so as to bring it back to China. It's equivalent of that. But when they left, as they were leaving, there was this weird guy, like standing by the train compartment, and then as the train was moving, the guy exploded. He was a revolutionary. He tried to kill the 5 officials, but before it's a guy called Wu Yue, but then the problem was, and he probably was a very amateurish kind of suicide bomber. The bomb, because of the movement of the train, it exploded prematurely. So the officials haven't even got onto the train yet. And he already exploded to bits. And what's interesting is that it will go more into the revolutionaries. But revolutionaries in general, not only were they against the Qing government, in general they were against the progressive actions of the Qing government.